She signed the divorce papers in tears at the company party. But those tears carried the memory of every sacrifice she made in silence long before that night. Years earlier, she had walked into that family believing loyalty mattered more than power. But with every deal she helped secure and every crisis she quietly solved, her name was pushed further into the shadows. At that same party, beneath crystal lights, champagne flutes, and mocking smiles, his entire family kicked her out as if she were nothing. But none of them realized the signature she placed earlier that day had already ended their control. They believed they were humiliating a woman with no future, but she was the billionaire who had just bought the company they were standing in. They laughed as she walked away alone, but the building, the boardroom, and every asset they trusted no longer belonged to them. What they called exile was actually her final move. But how did a woman they underestimated turn public? Humiliation into total ownership. And why did that single night leave an entire family bankrupt forever? The party had been announced as a celebration, an anniversary of growth, legacy, and family values. But the truth was written in the way security guards lingered near the exits and how executives avoided her eyes. She felt it before anyone spoke, but she stayed seated, hands folded neatly in her lap, because she had learned long ago that reacting too early only empowered those waiting to watch you break. The room glittered with success that night, but none of it had come without her. She remembered the early years clearly, long before the marble floors, before the private jets, before the company logo became recognizable across continents. She had been there when the books didn't balance, when investors pulled out, when the family fought behind closed doors over who would take responsibility if everything collapsed. She had stayed up nights restructuring contracts, rewriting proposals, and connecting dots they never even saw, but she never asked for credit because she believed partnership meant shared victories. But partnership slowly turned into convenience. Her suggestions became helpful notes. Her strategies became family decisions. And her presence became optional until the company stood strong again, but she stood alone. The man she married once promised protection, but he learned too quickly that silence could be mistaken for submission. He watched as his relatives spoke over her at dinners, dismissed her during meetings, and eventually spoke about her as if she weren't in the room at all. He never defended her, but he also never imagined she would one day stop defending him. The divorce papers were presented to her quietly, but the humiliation was planned loudly. They wanted witnesses. They wanted control of the narrative. They wanted her tears to mean defeat. When she stood to sign, the room fell into a hush, not out of respect, but anticipation. A woman signing away her marriage was entertainment to them, but they never questioned why she didn't beg, why she didn't argue, or why her hands stopped shaking the moment the pen touched paper, because that pen had already moved earlier that day. Hours before the party began, she sat across from a private legal team in a quiet boardroom on the top floor of a different building, one they had never bothered to visit. There were no raised voices, no celebration, no champagne, just documents, confirmations, and a final approval that transferred ownership of the holding company, controlling their entire operation. She didn't smile then, but she didn't hesitate either. She signed, but not as a wife. She signed as the owner. Back at the party, laughter returned too quickly once she finished signing the divorce papers. His mother was the first to stand, her expression sharp with satisfaction as she motioned toward the exit. Words followed, carefully chosen, publicly delivered, designed to erase her in one breath. She was escorted out under chandeliers she had paid for, past executives whose jobs depended on contracts she had secured, but none of them recognized what was already unfolding. They thought power lived in volume, in numbers, in who spoke the loudest in the room. But power had already left with her. She stepped into the night without turning back, but behind her the family toasted a victory that no longer belonged to them. They didn't know it yet, but the company they believed they had protected was already preparing to answer to someone new. And she was done being invisible. The next morning arrived clear and bright, but inside the family's mansion the air felt heavy, like the walls themselves were waiting for bad news. They moved through breakfast with the smug comfort of people who believed they had ended a problem, but the silence between their clinking cutlery carried something sharper than satisfaction. His mother sat at the head of the table like a judge, but even she kept replaying the moment her daughter-in-law had walked out without begging. A normal woman would have pleaded, a normal woman would have broken, but she had only cried, signed, and left, too calm, too controlled, too quiet. That's what happens when people forget their place, his mother said, but her voice lacked the ease she wanted it to have. Her son, still in his tailored shirt from the night before, scrolled through messages on his phone, but his expression tightened as notifications stacked up faster than he could read them. He told himself it was just the usual morning chaos. Executives, investors, legal meetings, but none of it looked normal. Then his father's phone rang. The ringtone echoed through the dining room like a warning, but the older man answered with irritation, expecting another congratulatory call from a business partner. "Good morning," the voice on the other end said, clipped and professional. "This is the legal department calling on behalf of the majority stakeholder." The fork paused midair. The father frowned. "Majority stakeholder? That's us." There was a brief silence, but it didn't sound uncertain. It sounded like the person on the phone was choosing the cleanest way to deliver a blow. "No, sir," the voice continued. "As of yesterday afternoon, control of the holding company was transferred. The majority stakeholder is now—" The father's face changed first. Not confusion, not anger, fear. He stood so fast the chair scraped the floor, but the phone was still pressed to his ear, and everyone at the table watched the color drain from his skin. "Transferred to who?" he barked, but his voice cracked at the end. "To Mrs." The voice began, then corrected itself smoothly. "To the woman you publicly removed from the company party last night." The room went still. His mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out because her brain refused to accept the words. Her son's hand tightened around his phone, but he didn't scroll anymore. He was frozen. "That's impossible," the mother finally snapped, but her voice was too loud for a room that had suddenly become too quiet. "She has no money. She came into this family with nothing." The father didn't answer her, but his eyes said what his mouth couldn't. Because he remembered something he had dismissed years ago. Small signs, quiet connections, strange meetings she never explained, calls she took late at night and ended the moment anyone walked in. Back then, they called it suspicious, but they also called it irrelevant. Now it looked like a blueprint. The legal voice continued, calm as a surgeon. "A board meeting has been called for 11 o'clock this morning. Attendance is mandatory. A new directive regarding leadership, spending, and liability will be issued." The father's hand shook as he lowered the phone, but his son jumped up immediately, trying to regain control through movement. "We'll fix this," he said, but the words sounded like a prayer he didn't fully believe. "We'll call our lawyers. We'll stop it." But his mother slammed her palm on the table. "Call her. Tell her to reverse it. She's still family whether she likes it or not." He hesitated, but he dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then her voice came through, steady, composed, and unfamiliar, like the voice of someone who had finally stepped into the life she had been hiding. "Hello," she said. He swallowed. "Listen, about last night." "You mean the company party," she replied, but her tone was careful, like she was speaking to someone on record. "The one where your entire family kicked me out." His mother leaned forward, but her son put the phone on speaker because she demanded to hear every word. "That was emotions," he tried. "We can talk privately." We can handle this like adults." A soft breath came from the other end, almost like amusement, but it held no warmth. "You had years to handle things like adults," she said. "But you chose public humiliation," his mother cut in, voice sharp. "Stop this nonsense. If you think you can play games with our company—" "Our company," the woman repeated, but the question was a blade wrapped in silk. "You mean the company I bought yesterday afternoon?" The mother's face twisted. "You can't just buy something you don't understand." "I understand it perfectly," the woman said. "I understand balance sheets. I understand contracts. I understand who signed what, and I understand who assumed they were untouchable." The son leaned closer, but panic was now leaking through his voice. "Why are you doing this? We were married." "We were married," she agreed. "But you treated me like a disposable accessory. You signed those divorce papers believing you were ending me, but I signed mine long before that. Ending your control." His father whispered, barely audible, "How much does she own?" The woman answered as if she heard him, but maybe she didn't need to. Maybe she knew exactly what they were asking. "I own enough," she said. "Enough to call the meeting, enough to remove decision-making authority, enough to audit every account, enough to freeze reckless spending." His mother's voice rose. "You're trying to destroy us." "No," the woman corrected. "I'm letting the consequences meet you." A silence fell, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had done, every insult, every dismissal, every moment they assumed she would always tolerate being small. The son tried one more time, softer now. "What do you want?" The answer came without hesitation. "I want what I should have had from the beginning." She said, "Respect, truth, accountability." Then her voice hardened, but it was still calm. "Be at the board meeting at 11, she said, "or watch your positions disappear without you." The call ended. His mother stared at the silent phone like it had insulted her, but her hands were trembling now, betraying her fear even when her pride refused to. "She's bluffing," she said, but nobody answered because nobody believed it. The father's gaze moved toward the windows, but all he could see was the reflection of their own faces, faces that had laughed too confidently the night before. Their son whispered, "She planned this," and the truth was worse than any insult. Yes, she planned it, but they planned her humiliation first. By the time they arrived at the corporate headquarters, the illusion of control had already begun to crack, but pride forced them to walk through the glass doors as if nothing had changed. Security greeted them politely, but not familiarly, and that difference, small but unmistakable, landed harder than any insult. The lobby looked the same, but it felt different. People stood straighter. Conversations stopped when the family passed. Phones were discreetly lowered, but eyes lingered, because something had shifted overnight and everyone could feel it. They entered the executive elevator without speaking, but every floor indicator lighting up felt like a countdown. No one said it out loud, but each of them was thinking the same thing. She was supposed to be gone. The boardroom doors were already open when they arrived, but the seats at the head of the table were occupied. Not by her. Not yet. A team of unfamiliar legal advisors sat neatly arranged, folders aligned, tablets glowing softly. At the far end, the interim chair, someone they had once approved without concern, stood as they entered, but he didn't smile. "Good morning," he said, but it wasn't a greeting. It was a formality. "Please, take your seats." His mother bristled, but she sat anyway, but the chair felt lower than it used to. At exactly 11 o'clock, the doors opened again. She walked in without ceremony, but the room responded anyway, not with applause, not with whispers, with attention. She wore no dramatic expression, but calm had replaced the fragility they remembered. Her posture wasn't defiant, but it was grounded, like someone who no longer needed permission to exist in the room. They expected anger, but she carried precision instead. She didn't sit immediately. She placed a folder on the table, thick, deliberate, and slid it forward. "Before we begin," she said, "I want clarity." Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be because silence bent toward it. "I acquired controlling interest through a holding structure finalized yesterday," she continued. "All transactions were reviewed, approved, and executed within legal boundaries, but I will not entertain arguments rooted in disbelief." His mother opened her mouth, but she raised one finger, not rudely but decisively. "This is not personal," she said, "but your decisions made it inevitable." The father's voice finally surfaced, brittle. "You planned this behind our backs." She nodded once. "Yes," she said, "but only after years of being excluded from conversations that shaped my life." The son leaned forward, desperation creeping in. "You're doing this to punish us." She met his eyes, but there was no satisfaction there, only distance. "I'm doing this to correct imbalance," she said. "Punishment implies emotion. This is governance." A murmur moved through the board, but she didn't pause. "Effective immediately," she continued. "An external audit will begin. All discretionary spending is frozen. Any executive contracts signed within the last 18 months will be reviewed." His mother's composure finally fractured. "You're stripping us of everything." She didn't deny it, but she reframed it. "I'm removing unchecked authority," she said. "There's a difference." She turned a page. "The previous leadership structure prioritized family loyalty over corporate accountability," she continued, but her tone remained measured. "That culture created risk, and risk requires correction." The father's hands trembled as he reached for water, but he didn't drink it. "And what about us?" his mother demanded. "You think you can erase decades overnight?" She paused, but not because she was unsure. "I think decades of arrogance erase themselves," she said. "I'm just documenting it." The board chair cleared his throat. "There's one more item," he said, and slid another folder forward, this one thinner, sharper. "Based on the audit findings already available, insolvency risk has been flagged," he continued. "Creditors have been notified. Several partners have requested immediate repayment clauses." The room went cold. "What does that mean?" the son asked, but he already knew. "It means," the chair said carefully, "that if corrective measures aren't met, the family's personal guarantees will be triggered." The mother stood abruptly. "This is extortion." She finally allowed emotion into her voice, but it wasn't anger. It was disappointment. "No," she said. "Extortion would have been demanding loyalty I hadn't earned. This is consequence." She gathered her folder, but she didn't leave. "You kicked me out believing humiliation would end me," she said, "but you never asked why I stayed silent all those years." Her eyes moved around the table, but she didn't linger on any one face. "I stayed because I believed people could grow," she said. "But growth requires humility, and you chose pride." She turned toward the door, but stopped once more. "You taught me that power is loud," she said, "but I learned that ownership is quiet." The doors closed behind her. Inside the room, panic finally surfaced. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in shallow breaths and shaking hands. The father whispered, "We're exposed." The son stared at the documents like they might rearrange themselves, and his mother sat frozen, realizing too late that the woman she dismissed had never been powerless. She had just been patient. The consequences did not arrive all at once, but they arrived relentlessly, but each hour stripped away another layer of protection the family once believed was permanent. By noon, partners who had toasted with them days earlier began requesting emergency calls, but those calls ended quickly when legal confirmations followed. By evening, credit lines were paused, but not accidentally, intentionally. The family gathered again, but this time not in their mansion or a boardroom. They gathered in a private office, smaller, quieter, and stripped of comfort. The walls were bare, but the silence was worse. because there was nothing left to distract them from the truth. His mother paced the room, but her sharp footsteps only amplified her loss of control. "This is revenge," she insisted, but the word sounded thin, like it couldn't carry the weight she needed it to. The father sat with his hands folded, staring at documents that no longer belonged to him. He had spent decades believing ownership meant inheritance, but he learned too late that ownership meant signatures, and hers were already on everything. Their son broke first. "She planned every step," he said quietly, "but we planned to humiliate her first." No one contradicted him because contradiction required denial, and denial had already failed. Across town, she sat in a quiet office overlooking the city she had once helped build from the margins. There were no celebrations, no raised glasses, no sense of triumph, but there was something steadier: closure. Her legal team reviewed timelines, but she watched the skyline instead, remembering the first time she had stood outside this building years earlier, unsure if she belonged anywhere near it. She had belonged all along, but she had mistaken access for acceptance. A message arrived from the board confirming the final numbers. The family's personal holdings were now entangled in insolvency proceedings. Their guarantees had been triggered, their legacy leveraged, exposed, and collapsing. She closed the message without emotion, but not without understanding. Power never needed to announce itself. It only needed to be recognized. Back in the small office, the father finally spoke. "We taught her how to survive us," he said, but his voice carried no pride. The mother sat heavily, her posture collapsing for the first time. They had measured strength in volume, dominance in visibility, and loyalty in silence, but the silence had been a lesson they never learned to read. The son stared at the floor. "I thought she needed us." "She never needed us," the father replied. "We needed her." But need does not reverse consequences. When the bankruptcy filings were finalized, the headlines were merciless but accurate. They spoke of mismanagement, unchecked entitlement, and the sudden transfer of control that left an entire dynasty dismantled. Her name appeared only once in the articles, but it didn't need repetition. She had no interest in public spectacle. The final interaction came weeks later, brief and unavoidable. She crossed paths with her former husband outside a courthouse, but the distance between them felt wider than the street separating them. "I didn't think you'd go this far," he said, but his voice lacked accusation, it carried regret. "I didn't think you'd push me that close," she replied, but her tone held no bitterness. They stood there for a moment, but closure doesn't always require conversation. As she walked away, she felt lighter, not because she had won, but because she no longer carried the burden of being misunderstood. Somewhere behind her, a family learned that humiliation can be temporary, but consequences are permanent. And she learned something too. Respect given freely builds loyalty, but respect withheld teaches precision. That night, the city lights reflected against her office windows, but she didn't look down at the world anymore. She looked forward, because she didn't destroy them. She simply stopped protecting them. Months later, the building still stood, but its meaning had changed. Where the family name once dominated the lobby walls, neutral branding now replaced it, clean, understated, deliberate. Employees moved with a different rhythm, but not fearfully. There was clarity now, but also accountability. She walked through the corridors without announcement, but people noticed anyway. Not because she demanded attention, but because calm authority had a way of reorganizing space around it. The company was stable again, but not indulgent. Excess had been cut, systems had been corrected, and loyalty was no longer inherited, it was earned. She never spoke publicly about what happened, but stories circulated quietly, not myths of revenge, but lessons of consequence. Some said the family disappeared overnight, but that wasn't true. They faded slowly, through courtrooms, settlements, and the long silence that follows when power no longer answers your calls. They learned what it meant to be ordinary, but ordinary offered no shortcuts back to relevance. As for her former husband, he learned something far less forgiving than bankruptcy. He learned what it meant to be remembered for what you failed to protect. She, however, was remembered differently, not as the woman who was kicked out of a party, not as the wife who cried while signing divorce papers, but as the one who understood that dignity didn't require permission, and that patience, when paired with clarity, could rewrite outcomes without raising a voice. Late one evening, she paused by the window of her office, city lights stretching endlessly ahead. She wasn't thinking about the past anymore, but she hadn't erased it either. It had taught her everything. That love without respect becomes leverage. That silence can be strategy. And that power, when earned quietly, doesn't need to prove itself. She turned off the light, closed the door behind her, and walked forward, not because she had crushed anyone, but because she had finally chosen herself. And that choice changed everything.